Today sees the much-anticipated meeting between US President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping in Trump's private estate at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. With Trump's position on China amongst the most publicized headlines of his presidential campaign, mostly around trade, and a recent tweet from Trump's own Twitter account predicting this meeting would be very difficult. What should we expect? We're joined now by Head of Political Risk at IHS Market. That's John Rains. John, welcome. This meeting today, fireworks or friendly talks?
Well, I think a little bit of both. I think that ultimately both sides here, though, do want friendly talks. I mean, for the Chinese, they have a big meeting coming up in the autumn where they're going to recraft that standing committee. They want a positive atmospherics coming out of this thing, so I don't think any kind of hostility from there. From the U.S. side as well, Trump, needs to deliver something to his base. We need to at least say that he's at least talked about trade, that they're moving in the right direction there as far as the trade deficit, but again, doesn't want to necessarily have something blow up in his home down in Florida.
Trump has also suggested that China is a currency manipulator. I mean, this all goes hand in hand with Trump's sort of angle at China going into the election in the US. Now, having come out of it as president, he's now got to lie in the bed that he's laid, really, in terms of his relationship with China. Do you see this coming up as an issue? Do you see him approaching Xi to talk about the way in which China is, in his view, manipulating the currency?
I think he's going to probably bring up the currency, but I think more importantly, it's going to look at, looking at how you bring in U.S. goods into China. Currently, we look at auto tariffs, 2% for the United States, 25% for China. And I think things along that nature, phytosanitary restrictions by the Chinese. Overall, what I expect to have happen is I think Donald Trump's going to come to Xi and say, listen, you've got to help me here politically. I think Xi understands that and will offer certain carrots where he can. The big problem is that long term, these two economies are very different. They're structured differently. So therefore, there is going to be a trade imbalance going forward. And it's very difficult to see how long term these things are going to change.
There's a couple of extra sensitive subjects that are in the background, of course, North Korea and Syria. First, I want to talk about North Korea. Will China intervene? I mean, Trump says all options are on the table with regard to what's happening at the moment. And there's been a lot of sort of opening salvos, I think, really, from the White House on how they would like potentially to deal with Kim Jong-un and his leadership in North Korea.
Well, I mean, it's difficult on both sides. There's a reason why this has been on the agenda for the last 25 years, and it's because it's a very, very difficult issue to handle for both sides. For the Chinese, I mean, of course, they're really worried about the prospect of refugees coming across the border into northern China. And then, of course, on top of that, you have the problem of if there's some type of instability inside North Korea, and actually the South will end up to actually take over North Korea, then you'd have the potential of a united Korea with a U.S. ally right there on the Chinese border. Very difficult for the Chinese to do something. Also very difficult for the U.S. You have Seoul, which is only, 50 kilometers away from the border. That would be hit by artillery fire. So it's very difficult for both sides to work here. So what we're expecting here is that the advancement of additional U.S. sanctions on North Korea, possibly with the implementation of some type of sanctions that really remove dollar access to the North Koreans. And I think in some ways the Chinese are worried about that, but there's very little wiggle room for both sides to work here. So I guess they're going to try to do where they can, but ultimately it's going to be very little.
In the last 48 hours, I think Trump's move on Syria has changed as well. China joined Russia recently and vetoed a UN resolution to impose sanctions on Syria over the alleged use of chemical weapons within the country. Since then, the most recent attack, and of course, as we've heard, that tragedy that's been developing, Trump now seems to have changed his view on Assad and now raised the chances of military action against the Syrian regime. Previously, we had known that Trump had begun to sort of align himself with Putin's view of Syria, and of course to go in with that, of course, to the Chinese view as well. Now all of a sudden, this recent attack would seem to put Trump at odds with the Chinese authorities. Do you think this will be raised as an issue?
Well, I think they're definitely going to have to. They have to talk about it. I mean, it's the number one issue that's currently going on in the world today. So I definitely think it comes up in the negotiations. But I think, again, it's the same thing that we've seen before, is that despite the idea that you can talk these things over leader to leader, ultimately, at the end of the day, the stakes in the ground are pretty much set, which means that it's very difficult for the U.S. to take military action now, especially with the possibility of coming into conflict with Russian military inside the theater of operations. What they can do is unilateral sanctions. So that's a possibility. credibility. It is interesting that we see a turn here by the Trump administration, and does that mean really that we're starting to see an increase in the power of the generals within his administration over those of the ideologues that have been represented by some of the members of his inner staff that helped him get elected in the first place? And I think that's an interesting dynamic to see play forward. I don't know if we've necessarily come to that direction yet, but is it something we see in North Korea? Is it something we see with China? Is it something we see in Syria? Certainly something that we're looking at going forward.
Now, of course, one of the big things that came out of a meeting earlier that Trump held with our very own Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, very, very positive pictures that came out of that, lots of positive body language coming out of that. And of course, at the other end of the spectrum, when Trump met Angela Merkel, very frosty, you could tell, and the pictures in the press next day made the two look as though they had no connection at all. What sort of photo opportunities do you see there being here? Clearly, Trump's going to want to give the world a positive vision, isn't he?
I think both leaders want to have a positive vision, but I definitely think both leaders in some respects also want a very controlled environment. So they don't want adverse questions coming in at the Chinese president or adverse questions coming in at Trump that either makes both sides look bad. So I think both of them are going to be, it's somewhat scripted. These things usually are between the Chinese and the United States, and I think that's pretty much what we're going to see here today in the next few days.
John, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks indeed for joining us. John Rains, there he's head of political risk at IHS Market.